Hello and welcome to My Life in Film 1987. So, 1987 in film, the year that I turned 14. Shall we get straight into it, because these lists of films are getting longer and longer every episode, because I was getting older and older and starting to latch onto a lot more films. So let's start with the top 10 US box office. At the top, Three Men and a Baby, not a film that I've really got particular love for, so I won't be talking about it in any detail. Fatal Attraction, Beverly Hills Cop, Good Morning Vietnam, Moonstruck, The Untouchables, The Secret of My Success, Stakeout, Lethal Weapon, and The Witches of Eastwick. This was the year that celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Bond franchise, and it was celebrated with the release of The Living Daylights in June. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is 50 years old this year, and it got a reissue to celebrate it. And Paramount Pictures unveiled a new logo to celebrate their 75 years in production. At the Oscars this year, The Last Emperor scored well, and Connery got an award for his support in Untouchables. So let's move straight on to the films of note. So one film that's of note for the wrong reasons is riding on a wave of his roles in various films like the First Blood and Rambo series, the Rocky series. Stallone decided to tackle another sport, and that sport was arm wrestling, because the sport of arm wrestling really does need a film, and Over the Top was that film that Stallone gave us, and this is not worth checking out. If you've never seen it, I envy you, because this is a bad film. This shows the desperation to latch onto any kind of sport, to do an antagonistic kind of journey around. It doesn't always pay off, and arm wrestling is not a sport. I don't care. Even if you are a competitive arm wrestler, I'm sorry, you're not doing a sport. Anyway. On the flip side, we did have Kubrick bring us his entry into the series of Nam films that were coming out, because Nam films were quite a big thing around this period. I mean, we've already mentioned Platoon, there was things like Hamburger Hill, and so on and so forth. But we got Full Metal Jacket this year. Full Metal Jacket sees Kubrick tackling Nam in two ways. He does a film of two parts. The first part being the boot camp, the training of these raw recruits, these people who've signed up or been drafted, and showing how the most unlikely of people were thrust into this situation. And then we flip to the war itself, and rather than it being the jungle-based aspect, it's a very different approach that we take, following like the media aspect, but also looking at the it's almost coldness that soldiers end up having. And this is typically Kubrick, is that his characters are very cold and emotionless in order for us to convey the emotion for them. But it's that first half of the film that a lot of people remember this film for. The boot camp introduced us to R. Lee Ermey as the drill sergeant, who improvised and made up a lot of his own lines because he was actually a drill sergeant. And it also showcased to the world Vincent D'Onofrio as Private Pyle, and gave us one of the most chilling performances that actor. I mean, he is a great actor. He's great, even in the worst of films, and I'm looking at you, Jurassic World. Even in the worst of films, D'Onofrio is great. This is one of the best war films to date, and it's one of the war films that I go back to on a regular basis. Full Metal Jacket is an absolute classic. Back to the lower end, and a film that's not an absolute classic, but I think everyone deserves to watch it just once, just to see how bad it is, and that's Jaws: The Revenge. Apparently, the story of this is that apparently sharks have vendettas. Now, anyone who's played the recent video game Man-Eater will know that, yeah, sharks have vendettas, because you play a shark with a vendetta. But no, it's terrible. A shark is after revenge on the people who killed its offspring, and this film is notorious for how bad it actually is made, how bad the deaths are. I watched it once on home release, and I've never watched it again. I've never wanted to watch it again. I've even watched Jaws 3D at least 5 times, but I will not touch this with a barge pole ever again. Michael Caine is in it, and don't let that make you think it's going to be anything good, because remember, this guy did The Swarm in 1978, but by doing Jaws Revenge, he showed that The Swarm wasn't just a blip on the radar. He is capable of bad decisions, very bad decisions. Bad, Michael, bad. I'm going to mention The Princess Bride. Now, I'm mentioning that not because it's beloved to me, because it isn't. And it upsets so many people whenever I say that I don't get the love for it. I didn't latch onto it when it was first released. It must have been the early part of this century that I finally got round to watching it. And after being told for a decade and a half how amazing this film was and how it's a timeless classic, I watched it and went, is it? I rewatched it last year when we covered it on the podcast, and no, still don't feel the love for it. I don't get the love for the film. It feels shoddy, cheap and stagey, and I don't know whether it's supposed to, but it doesn't work for me. And maybe it is because I didn't watch it when it came out, and so I wasn't there at the time. It's just not the classic for me. Another film that I missed but I covered last year as part of my Oscar history project for the show was Wall Street. If you want to know what I thought about that one, yeah, it is a good film, but it's very much of its time. But on the old podcast, we covered it. That's where you'll find me discussing it in more detail. Back to Vietnam for another Vietnam film, and it's a different approach to a Vietnam film this time, with Good Morning Vietnam. This sees Robin Williams as a disc jockey who's recruited by the Armed Forces Radio Service to motivate the troops, and his antics and wild nature definitely lift the spirits of the troops and makes him popular with the soldiers. However, the superiors don't think his antics are appropriate. This is a film that I really need to revisit. I've not revisited it for about 2 decades. I think I last saw it in the 90s, and I have nothing but fond memories for this. I did watch it a few times when it first came out. Robin Williams playing to all of his strengths. It's him who completely sells the film, but it's not just all the comedy, it's also how much emotion he puts into characters. Great film, well worth checking out. A film that I recently revisited is Lethal Weapon. Oh, now this goes down as possibly the best buddy cop movie of all time. It sets the formula that every other buddy cop movie from that point onwards followed. Dick Donner directed Mel Gibson and Danny Glover from a screenplay by Shane Black. Gotta love Shane Black, except for The Predator. Don't love that one, Shane. Sorry. I know you were screwed over like on set and in post-production with it, but still, your name's attached. Lethal Weapon is utter perfection of an action comedy. It's, like I say, it's the best of the buddy cop movies. Mel Gibson is perfectly placed as the suicidal and over-the-top extreme Riggs, and Danny Glover as the I'm getting too old for this shit Murtaugh is brilliant. Throw in some of the soap operatic family dramas going on at the same time, and it's a testament to how good Shane Black is as a screenwriter, for how many elements work so well within this film without going against each other, without upsetting any balance. Great film. Sticking with the action and the cops, and we have Beverly Hills Cop 2. Now, the first film was really good, and this film is not a scratch on the first film. I'll say that straight out the gate. It's nowhere near the same level as the first film. But this second outing for Axel Foley, played again by Eddie Murphy, is still worth checking out, as he heads over to Beverly Hills to help find out who shot the police captain over there. This gives it an excuse to have him team up with Billy and Taggart again, and it allows for that pair to have a much larger presence in this film, and that alone gives it something worth checking out as a sequel, so that you get a different aspect to it. It adds enough new stuff to the mix to make it work. Still, like I say, nowhere near as good as the first, but not a bad film. The Untouchables. Now, we covered this again on the show last year. We went through a lot of these classics. This is what I mean about, like, this is the era that really captivated me, because these are the films that are coming up quite frequently as rewatches for the podcast, and there's a very good reason, because they are close there, man. But The Untouchables is a pure majesty as a film. The sweeping direction from Brian De Palma, the cinematography is delicious. And the score by Morricone is one of my favourite Morricone scores of all time. This is an all-time favourite film that I go back to very, very, very regularly. And when it first came out on home release, I pretty much watched it on a loop. I'd watch it multiple times in a day. It's just got style. It's got iconic moments. It's got lines of dialogue. It's a pure hammy role by Connery, who plays an Irish cop with a Scottish accent like he normally does. But great, absolutely great film. If you've never seen The Untouchables, do yourself a favour, seek it out as soon as this video ends. So we mentioned at the head of the show that Dalton's first outing as Bond came out, The Living Daylights, this year, because it was the anniversary of the Bond franchise. And this first outing for Dalton still had a touch of the Moore factor to it, but with gadgets and puns in there. But it was also kind of reining things in and trying to do a harder-edged Bond. It'll be on the next film that he goes more hard-edged, but it was trying to get it back to some kind of seriousness. Dalton is absolutely fantastic in this role. He is one of the best Bonds. He gets overlooked a lot because he was only in 2 films. Some people seem to think that if you're only in 1 or 2 films, then it's because you were rubbish. It's not. He wasn't. He was absolutely brilliant in the role. But sadly, they tried to make a grittier, harder-edged Bond at a time when all other action films were going for the jokey approach. And that's what the problem was. It wasn't a problem with Bond itself, it's a problem with the environment around it. In our modern age, we've got a harder edge Bond again, but it works now because people had been introduced to like your Bourne franchise, and the Mission Impossible franchise had gone harder edged. And by latching onto that kind of mentality in the industry and also in the public perception of what a spy thriller should be, a harder edge Bond works. I'm sure eventually we'll go back to a comedy Bond, and I'm sure eventually we'll go back to a garbage Roger Moore style Bond. But Living Daylights, often overlooked even by Bond fans, worth checking out. Not great, but definitely better than at least the 4 films that preceded it. And for an example of how action films went over the top and cheesy, you can't look further than anything that has Arnold Schwarzenegger in. And this year, he was in 2 of them. He was in, first of all, The Running Man. The Running Man, it's allegedly adapted from a Stephen King story, but it bears no relation to the Stephen King story. I mean, it's not as bad as an adaptation as The Lawnmower Man was, which was absolutely terrible. But Running Man sees him as someone who's framed for a massacre and then put onto a game show called The Running Man to try to escape, and if he can complete and survive through it, he gets to escape. However, the people who've won on this have never been seen again, and it's all a setup to just create some spectator sport for the masses. If you look at our world today with the reality TV and the obsession with celebrity status and everyone watching with interest as everything unfurls live in front of them, The Running Man foretold where we will be, and we're only a step away from this taking place. It's absolute cheese. It's a very loose adaptation of the Stephen King story, but who cares? There's so much fun to be had, and Arnold is on fine form with his quips, and sometimes his quips can be bad, but on here, things like him shouting out, "Hey light bulb, Christmas tree, yeah." Very bad accent. If you've never seen Running Man, don't watch it expecting it to be a perfect film, because it's not. It's a bit wonky in places, but it's fun. It's so much fun. However, a film that stands up a lot better is Predator. Now this one, directed by John McTiernan and starring Arnold and Carl Weathers, Bill Duke's in there, Jesse Ventura. It is testosterone in the jungle, but with an alien menace hunting down the soldiers that are sent in there on a mission. It is pure beefy testosterone from start to finish, but it is a magnificent action film. It's an example of a one alien versus multiple trained experts taking them out one by one. The absolute threat and menace of the Predator cannot be overlooked. It's a great film. I love going back to this, and it span off sequels, which Mixed bag. We'll get to them over time, but this first film is it's iconic, it's legendary, and Shane Black, who we mentioned earlier as screenwriter on Lethal Weapon, actually stars as one of the soldiers, rather unconvincingly. It doesn't seem like he deserves to be one of these big beefy guys, but a great film, well worth checking out. That's Predator. As you can guess, we're into the sci-fi and fantasy, and Inner Space came out this year. Now, back in 1966, there was a film that came out called The Fantastic Voyage, and it saw, after an attempt on the life of, I think, Russian premier or some diplomat, that a group of medics and scientists are shrunk down and injected in to try to repair the damage that's been done to the brain. And it results in, like, they have to pass through the ventricles of the heart, and they have to find the way through, and the antibodies are trying to attack. And it was a science fiction adventure. It was a science fiction adventure, and an excuse to just showcase off some great effects. Well, Inner Space was inspired by that and took that concept, and it took the inspiration. It added in an industrial espionage plot instead, and the film sees Dennis Quaid shrunk down and injected into Martin Short. The film plays for laughs, but it doesn't overdo it. There's a lot of charm, a lot of heart, and it works. Martin Short, this is an era that Martin Short was really, really on good form, and it's kind of like a buddy film, where the buddy's actually inside you, which sounds really wrong. But if you've not seen Inner Space, the effects work mostly hold up, but it's the fun and charm that definitely still holds up. Robocop came out this year. Peter Weller in Verhoeven's Jesus allegory. Yes, when Murphy is brutally gunned down by Clarence Boddicker and his gang, he is put back together as Robocop after having all of his life and memories wiped from his brain. But something still remains in there, and Boddicker is still out there and working for Dick Jones, the head of OCP. Well, one of the heads of OCP. It's a satire. It's a stab at corporate mentalities. It's a bloody and brutal and violent action film. It's a mix of everything. It's Verhoeven. What do you expect? It's well worth watching. It's often repeated. It's often revisited, and it's one of the films that I remember when it came out, because it was an 18 rated, and so we couldn't see it, so we had to wait for the home release. Read into that what you want. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Now, I'm not mentioning this because it's a good film. It's not. It's far from it. It's terrible. It's the worst film that DC have ever given us. And that's saying something, because Steel. Just putting that out there. But anyway, you'll believe that a franchise can sink when you watch this film. It was cheaply made. It was a rush job all around rights issues. The film is notoriously bad. But Reeve still gave it his all. He still was the consummate professional and still approached it as though it was a serious subject. That's what made him so great in the role, even though he clearly must have known that it was not going to play out well. He still dedicated everything to it. What an iconic legend. This is worth seeing on the DVD or Blu-ray releases with the commentary, because the commentary is by one of the writers, Mark Rosenthal, and it's not a praising commentary, but it's an interesting one, because he points out the problems with the film himself, and he points out the changes that there were from what his story was to what you see on screen, and so you get to understand how it all went wrong. It's one of those films that the film itself is terrible, but watch it with the commentary and it's something more. There's things like the Nuclear Man, that he has long claws and he roars and when he's fighting, and that's because he was supposed to have been a shapeshifter, and so he's supposed to be shape-shifting into like bears and like beasts and things like that. But they decided that would have cost too much, so instead they just said, oh well, give him long fingernails for the claws and just play it like that. And rather than changing the dialogue for the fights and having him actually talk and say things, they kept in roars, grunts, and that shows how little care there was in the making of the film. It's well worth seeing with the commentary, but don't expect much from the film itself. Masters of the Universe came out this year. Now, I love the cartoon. When I was young, I used to love the He-Man cartoon. I never had He-Man toys because they were never bought for me, because I was getting all the Transformers toys, let's be honest. And I had high hopes for the film. However, I left it feeling extremely disappointed. Dolph Lundgren and Frank Langella failed to bring life to my animated hero, and it's a film that I've only been back to revisit once, and it's just not good. What a shame. We'll move on to horror. So let's run through horror, because horror did well this year. This year saw Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. Now, whereas the second film was a bit bad, this third film is a very worthy sequel, and some would even say it's almost on par with the first film. It leans more into the lore, and the setting now is a mental institute, and the teens inside it are Freddy's new targets, having been brought along because Nancy is back, because she's now working at the hospital with these kids. When she realises that Freddy's back on the scene, she tries guiding the kids in their fight to survive. But Freddy himself also has a connection with the Institute, and this is what I mean by it leans into the lore. This is definitely a worthy sequel. This one and the next film at least that follows are well on par. Get it checked out if you've never checked it out. If you've only ever seen the first one and second one and thought the second one was so bad you don't want to watch anymore, ignore that second one. Go straight on to the third one. Evil Dead 2. So it was less a sequel and more a remake, prequel? Yeah, I don't know. Sam Raimi did this with the Evil Dead series, that each time that he did a follow-up, he kind of retroactively changed elements of the previous film to retell them, and then took the story further. And the bigger budget that he had for this film gave him a chance to go back and reanalyse what he did on that first film. So he goes full throttle on this film. Bruce Campbell's unassuming hero of the first film is now given a bit more of a character and a bit more quippy personality. The first act is a rehash of the events of the first film, and then we're whisked into the frenzy of the new stuff with puns, such as, trapping a severed hand underneath a bucket and putting books on top, which the top one says, "A farewell to arms." Nice pun. Chainsaws and crazy camera work. It is Sam Raimi doing what Sam Raimi does best, and it is an absolute joyride of a film. Creepshow 2, another anthology from Stephen King's short stories. 3 of his stories are brought to life on this one, and they're potentially gruesome, but they come over quite cheap, which kind of diminishes the effect. But there's still some fun to be had if you approach it as it's supposed to be, representative of those cheap, schlocky, throwaway comic book rags of yesteryear. Worth checking out. Not a scratch on the first Creepshow, and nowhere near how good Cat's Eye was. The Lost Boys made vampires cool this year, and resulted in, for the next decade and a half, 2 decades, posters of characters from it being on every student's wall in every city around the world. Joel Schumacher is the only person I know of who can make a film that, even when you throw in a waxed up, buffed up, random muscular saxophone player, it doesn't upset how cool the film is overall. Kiefer Sutherland is immediately iconic as David, making everyone want to be a vampire, and he's the leader of the Pack of the Vamps in Santa Carla. Corey Haim and Feldman are buddied up on this. Alex Winter, Jason Patrick. The film is very 80s in feel, but it still stands up well today, and it's another one that I go back to quite frequently, and I keep expecting to watch it and go, oh, actually, it's not good. But every time that I watch it, I go, oh, actually, I still love it. Lost Boys, well worth it. Now, if you want proper visceral horror, Clive Barker's Hellbound Heart was brought to the big screen under the name Hellraiser by the writer himself, and it's so raw and powerful. It made the demonic presence of the Cenobites, and in particular Pinhead, immediately iconic, despite them only being on screen for around 5 minutes. Some cheapness around some of the effects. There's one of the demons chasing them out of the labyrinth. You can see people pushing the trolley behind. However, there's nothing can be said to knock the jaw-dropping stop-motion rebuilding of Frank moment, which is absolutely timeless, gruesome in detail, but perfectly put together. This is horror, and the Hellraiser franchise rapidly went downhill from the second film onwards, but this first film is still enough to make me hope that we get a return to the Hellraiser franchise again, done well. Comedy-wise, Mannequin came out this year. Kim Cattrall and Andrew McCarthy rom-com about a guy who falls in love with a mannequin who comes to life. Yeah, likely story, buddy. Now you're going to pay for that dress that you just soiled. Never really got Mannequin. I never really dug it. I know that some people have quite a lot of love for it, but it doesn't quite work for me. However, you are talking. I am talking as the person who will now say that Police Academy 4: Citizens on Patrol is worth checking out. Yep, I still dug the Police Academy films. I was still having fun with it by this point. The new recruits from the previous film are now sent out on patrol and buddied up with citizens on patrol, a volunteer cop scheme set up to try to fight crime in the city. It's more fun, it's the usual shticks, you know what to expect by this point, and it works just about. A great comedy this year was Roxanne. It was Cyrano de Bergerac remade with Steve Martin and Daryl Hannah, and it's sweet and charming and extremely funny. Steve Martin is playing fully to his strengths, and if you've seen any of the adaptations of Cyrano de Bergerac, you know that the character's supposed to have wit and rapport, and Steve Martin encapsulates that perfectly. This is a great film. I recommend this to everyone. Go and check it out. A film that's often overlooked, which came out this year, and that's Dragnet. Out of all of the Tom Hanks films, people kind of forget this one, and there's a lot of dismissiveness to it being a bit, it's a bit rubbish. It was an attempt to do a more comedy, updated version of the Dragnet TV series, and maybe it came at the wrong time. In the same way that the Starsky and Hutch film, about a decade and a half later, would do like Starsky and Hutch and make it a comedy. Dragnet had done it back here. It tries a bit too hard to riff on the buddy cop aspects. It tries too hard to riff on Police Academy style of humour at times, and it doesn't quite have the balance right, but it is enjoyable nonsense overall, and Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd pair up quite well on screen. Spaceballs came out this year. Now this is highly regarded by many people, but I simply find it okay. It's the sign of Mel Brooks slipping away, as far as I was concerned, after a solid run of comedies that I can rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. And whilst Rick Moranis in Spaceballs brings some absolute hilarity, and he plays to every strength that actor has, he gives everything to it. The rest of the film around him feels a little bland and doesn't quite work. Planes, Trains and Automobiles, which sees John Candy and Steve Martin, who's a busy man this year, as you can see, in a John Hughes film. This is packed with the kind of charm that you expect from John Hughes, coupled with perfect comic partnership of the stars. It's a quotable classic, as Martin and Candy, playing Neil and Del, try to make the way home for Thanksgiving, and the pair are the most unlikely companions you could ever find. This is a film which plays on the comedy right up until the final act, and then it flips it and makes you feel good about the world again. It's a great film. It's a classic. It stands up well. It's not aged. Timeless. One thing that has aged though, Eddie Murphy, again a guy who was a busy man around this time. He was on a roll of success, and so he gave a big screen outing for one of his stand-up shows, Raw. And Eddie Murphy's Raw was a smash hit, and it is hilarious. And I remember rolling with laughter watching it over and over and over. However, recent years rewatching, it's fair to say a lot of the humour hasn't aged well. It's still a perfect example of how electric a presence Murphy was on stage, and it showcases how he can engage and how he really performs, but the comedy is not aged well. Families this year. I mean, families were basically expected to go and see all the sci-fi films and like everything that I've mentioned already, except for maybe Hellraiser. Don't take your kids to see Hellraiser. Ooh, mess them up. So all that we really had new-wise that I can pick out from this year was Harry and the Hendersons, which it led to a TV series spin-off. It was Bigfoot and the Hendersons as a movie, Harry and the Hendersons over in the UK. The family comedy sees John Lithgow and his family accidentally run over a Sasquatch. Thinking that it's dead, they strap it to the roof of the car and take it home, hoping to get some fame and fortune because they've managed to find Bigfoot, even though they killed him. However, turns out Sasquatch isn't dead, and after a few little encounters in the house where they think he's on a rampage, they discover that he's actually quite a sweet and charming creature and quite timid. And so they seek to help get him back to nature and help him on his way. However, at the same time, there's a hunter tracking down the Bigfoot who's managed to work out that someone's took it home. It's fun. It's not something to go back to. But the makeup and effects are pretty solid. And, yeah, like I say, it's spun off into a TV series. It's got enough charm to be able to carry that. Just about. This year also, like I said earlier, it had sort of reissue of Snow White, an apple a day keeps the oh she's dead hi ho, and also Disney reissued The Aristocats and Cinderella, which just shows that they were kind of like having a quiet year. So that basically, I mean, we're looking at half an hour being here talking, so that basically rounds up the films that stood out for me this year. Now, I know there's a lot of films that you'll now be going, but what about? Well, let me just run through the ones that I've not seen first, so you can go, oh, that's why you've not mentioned them. I've not seen Angel Heart. I've not seen Raising Arizona. I've not seen The Monster Squad. Now, despite the fact I'm a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft, I've not watched The Curse, which this has Will Wheaton in it, apparently, so I need to dig this one out, don't I? And it's another adaptation of Colour Out of Space, which is a really good story. I've not seen Cry Freedom. I've not seen The Last Emperor. I've not seen Emperor of the Sun. I've not seen Empire of the Sun. I've not seen Broadcast News. And I've not seen The Gate. So is there anything else that I've not mentioned, that I've possibly not seen, or maybe I saw and I didn't quite like it, but you thought needed to be mentioned, you thought represented 1987 in some way, shape or form, it had some impact on you throughout your life? Pop it in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, share, you know the business, and more than anything else, keep watching films. Thank you very much.